Good evening, campers, it's me, Kira, and today we're going to talk about Anna GAVALDA's Billie. Everybody calm down. I didn't read her on ebook. That don't count as reading. It's not my rules. If you got a complaint, talk to BookTube's resident Sonic the Hedgehog. I don't know. For the paperback and me Teds, rest assured, this is video proof of me holding the physical book. You see, something really weird happened. I was in Waterstones when I bumped into someone who knew who I was. I have no idea if they would consent to me putting up this photo, but nevertheless, I'm going to cover them all up with crap. But I had to run. I had to run away from England back to the safe haven of Wales. I had a tube to catch, and therefore I was going to buy them a book. Alas, I could only give them a book. Thus, knowing that I had just completed Billie the night before, reached into my suitcase and provided them this copy. I would argue that I did quite a nice thing here, because this cover is way better than the alternative. This cover is absolutely horrendous. But if you think that's horrendous, have you seen the French copy? Have you seen the official French copy? I truly wish that I was making this up. This is a legitimate French copy of Billie that you can buy, and somehow it is officially worse than Paris's opening Olympic ceremony. But if anyone was going to do it, it would be the French. It's not just funny because it's a horrendous cover, but the fact that this had to be okayed by a lot of people. A lot of people saw this and went, oui, only the French. I'm not even begun to talk about the book. I'm very sorry for this tangent, but let me explain why this cover, I think, is the best cover, because it actually sets up the opening pages of Billie. Billie and her friend Frank have been hiking in the Cevennes. Like their Anglo counterpart, Jack and Jill, they went up the hill and they both went tumbling after. Frank is not doing very well after his fall. In fact, he asks Billie to check that his winky still works. Only the French. But all that aside, Billie and Frank must wait to be rescued, and Frank begins to wane in and out unconsciousness. Billie, laying by the side of Frank, begins to recount their story to one of the twinkling stars above. Based on that last sentence, you could envision that this is going to take two routes, the religious or the spiritual. GAVALDA does something different. She goes for the twee. Billie, in recounting not only her story, but how she met Frank and how they ended up being so close, to the little star that twinkles above them, of which "Oh little star" is repeated almost as nauseam, is told in a way could be considered charmingly nostalgic, but it can move into the inauthentic and overly simplistic at times, with cliches aplenty. Yet how GAVALDA has decided to construct this novella and the way in which to tell it, forcing her character Billie to tell the story of her and Frank's lives really within one evening, allows Billie to ultimately spiel off as much information as she physically can off the top of her head. There is no real space for depth, for poetry. This is a common person telling their story. The colloquial, the unsophisticated, the inelegant is ultimately the twee. Billie is not a sophisticated, elegant person. She is someone who has struggled throughout her whole life about who she is and the role she is meant to take in society. And the only person who has ever believed in her, as we are to find out, is Frank. GAVALDA's storytelling, all whilst gunning head first into cliche and stereotype, somehow by a way that only the French could possibly do it, writes a story that is modern and contemporary and making it feel fresh. GAVALDA is recounting the story of Billie and her relationship to Frank. The majority of this is set across one summer, where Billie meets Frank in theatre class, where Billie and Frank are to learn the lines and devise a piece from, forgive me as I'm definitely going to have to read this, from Alfred de Musset's On ne badine pas avec le mot. I haven't heard of this play, I haven't researched into the play, I'm not going to look any further into the play. But you don't really need a vast amount of knowledge to jump into this, because GAVALDA tells you the main thing that you're meant to take away. There are two people, the nobleman Perdican and Camille, the object of his desire. Outside of school during the holidays, Billie and Frank are to learn their retrospective lines, but Billie really decides to question the roles that they have been given. Why does the boy have to play the boy? Why does the girl have to play the girl? Surely there's a way for them to express their true feelings if they are to play the roles more aligned with them. Because Billie sees herself as Perdican, someone who has to deal with love, loss and rejection due to the family situation that she is currently dealing with. And while she doesn't expressly say it, it is suggested that Camille would be better for Frank because ultimately he's queer, and Camille's character is all about the contested love within her. Frank doesn't really want to think deeply about this. He just wants to meet the expectations that are set for him. He wants to learn the lines, perform the piece, and have a good grade. Frank just wants to meet expectations, and let's be honest, it's stereotypical, it's a bit cliche, and really it's twee, but that's the beauty of GAVALDA's novel. Frank does not meet the expectations of his own family because of his sexuality, because of his reluctance to say who he really is. Whereas you have Billie, who in Frank's eyes defies all expectations, but that is at the cost of her family having no expectations of her. While their devised piece is applauded by their class, it is suggested by GAVALDA that one line connects these two characters, and allow me to paraphrase. Camille asks Perdican to raise his head, and Perdican responds to Camille to say how beautiful her eyes are. And it is this line that builds the friendship, because both of them understand that they are going to keep each other's heads up. They are not going to be downtrodden by their current circumstances, and see the beauty within their friendship and ultimately within the world. To reiterate, this one summer forms up the majority of this story, and the rest we have a real condensed, as GAVALDA calls it, a season 2 of what is to happen, where we rush through a lot of the major events that have formed the foundations of Frank and Billie's connection. To reiterate, this drama project really is the majority of the novel. This is where we spend a lot of our time building up the foundation of Billie and Frank. From here on out, to use the words of Billie that she tells the star, we're now going to move into season 2. Season 1, we've met the characters, we've established them, now we have to get into the plot. And here we gallivant through the climactic, the traumatic, but ultimately the key moments that have brought Billie and Frank to the Cevennes today. The dilemma, or the main crux within GAVALDA's Billie, is how do we meet societal expectations, especially when you have two characters like Billie and Frank who don't fit into the traditional expectations of society. And yes, there is a nod that within modern society there are less expectations around identity and gender, but there are still expectations that we have to meet. The ending of Billie somewhat provides an answer. While I think it's somewhat of a stretch, I can see it being a happy medium for Billie and Frank to live the lives that they want at the behest of society. But I think GAVALDA ultimately succeeds, and the reason how she succeeds is the voice of Billie. Billie's voice is captivating, and it needs to be. This is predominantly monologue, but it's captivating because it's so normal. There is nothing extraordinary about Billie, and that's what makes this novel different. There's no romanticization, there's no hyperbole. It's told through Billie's eyes in the most candid, normal way possible, and it's somewhat refreshing. And that is in some part GAVALDA's decision to make this a recounting of story. Ultimately, there are no stakes here. You're not wondering what is going to happen to them because you know that they've just been hiking in the Cevennes. Even when we encounter the problems, the trials and the tribulations, you know that they're going to get out of this situation, even if it is heartbreaking or even if it is endearing. For me, Billie is an 8 out of 10.